We came together a few weeks ago for the first time, so it's official, Conner. You are now officially a repeat offender. So welcome to that status. Don't know if that's good or not, but Conner Drigotas has got his own website. And in the earlier portion of tonight's conversation with Conner, we discussed sort of the motivation for that, a way to essentially control your message and to make sure that it's given the opportunity to have life and to breathe out there and to reach out to people, as opposed to this sort of the siloing that's taking place on conventional social media. So you've got a pretty provocative article. And by the way, that picture, God bless Facebook, that grabbed a lot of attention. there was no doubt that where you were coming from on this. You grabbed people right by the throat. But now more than ever, since it appears that the Republican Party, the self-appointed, self-proclaimed Party of Liberty, is starting to crumble, if you will, in their support of the Second Amendment, or in my case, what I take more seriously, the innate, natural-born right of someone to engage in self-defense, which I believe, for lack of a better word, trumps a piece of paper. They're caving, to be blunt. So Conner at ConnerDrigotas.com, that's ConnerDrigotas, has written, I believe, a pretty interesting piece in how we respond to gun control efforts and the abridgment of the Second Amendment. So the article is pretty provocative. Gun control is dead, and so is the debate. What are your thoughts behind this? How did you arrive at this?
Honestly, I think the first thing that's really important to acknowledge is this has been an incredibly difficult week to have this conversation. This is an article that obviously people were interested in because of what happened, but it's also simultaneously the worst time to talk about it because we're seeing an incredible amount of gun violence, which is uncomfortable and it's terrible. And I want to acknowledge we all want to see the end of gun violence, but there is, however, a huge difference in opinion of how to accomplish that goal. First, gun control measures being proposed by Democrats and now Republicans will not work. And that's the point of the article, and that we'll get into some of the details of. But second, when we talk about gun control and talking about this topic, there's one side of the debate that's coming up with ideas, and they're putting stuff forward, even if those ideas are bad and they will not work. But the opposition, who is pro-liberty, needs to be more active in coming forward with proposals of how to deal with this crisis, simply because, again, we all want gun violence to end. Now the devil's in the details of how to make that happen. So the article itself had 5 different points, and we can approach those if you'd like, or talk about the topic generally, whatever you'd prefer.
Well, let's first start out with, I think my talking point has always been that public tragedy should never, ever impact public policy. And if that sounds harsh and if that sounds cold, I'll apologize that you feel that way. But ultimately, we are a nation whose history is littered with very public tragedies. I argue that the public tragedies, because of the digital age we live in, are that much more upfront and in person. That, of course, does not diminish the gravity of these public tragedies, but it certainly gives the appearance that the problems, or perhaps the solutions, are more invasive and the problems are more pervasive than they seem to be. I know, one prominent individual was taken to task because he showed how many people died. My God. But also pointed out how many people died of suicide, how many veterans died that day. He ran through a whole series of statistics which showed that we've got all sorts of issues and problems. And I think
And ironically, that was Neil deGrasse Tyson, I believe, who is traditionally very left-leaning, and he was taken to task online for making those points.
Right, and because if you're a student of history, one only look at the Cultural Revolution that happened in China and understand that very often the left feed upon themselves incessantly if, in fact, that one moment, and it may be just a moment, that you diverge from the theocracy, if you will. So I just have to say that because I think that's we still need to step aside as a society and try and, for lack of a better term, curate our approaches based on a far longer term picture than whatever horror, and it was horror, was perpetrated upon a populace at any one time. So let's go specifics. I'm big on specifics, and you list 5. So let's start at the very top. First of all,
I want to
is,
identify what we're talking about first, and that's red flag laws, gun confiscation, mandatory buybacks. These are the kind of things that these 5 points essentially invalidate. Those are bad ideas, and these 5 ideas that I listed hopefully convince you that these will not work moving forward.
Right. So let's break them out step by step. Gun buybacks are the perfect example of good intentions, because we're going to ascribe to the opposition, for the purpose of tonight's conversation, that these in fact are good intentions, that the people doing them intend to have a society that is freer of violence. So why, for example, gun buybacks, what could possibly go wrong? Why don't they work?
Well, for so many reasons. I think one of the more famous examples is the guy who went out and bought a bunch of PVC pipe, installed a trigger-looking item on the bottom of it, spray painted it, and then traded them in for $200 a piece, and then went out and bought himself a much nicer rifle as a result. There's a huge lack of education. And when you're looking at that, the first point that I made in the article is there are just so many guns in America. Doing a buyback program, if you think that's going to solve the problem, there are simply too many firearms for any of these proposals to be viable in America. It's almost 400 million guns and an estimated 12 trillion rounds of ammo, according to several studies that I found. So, those are just astronomical numbers. And to assume that any of these proposals would even come close to cracking that, it's just not going to happen.
Well, there are members of the progressive community in the left who will say, at the same time, that you have no chance against the government, that the government, that you have this purported reason you have the ability to overthrow a tyrannical government simply doesn't exist in the first world, while simultaneously saying you have no chance against the government because of the weaponry you have. While, by the way, simultaneously, it's been pointed out by people far smarter than I this week, they are at the same time screaming about concentration camps along the border. So, which is it? Do we have a tyrannical government or not? On one hand, they're arguing we have. Number two, we shouldn't have the weaponry to overthrow a tyrannical government. Yet at the same time, they would prevent us from having it. Yet at the same time, they don't want anyone to have guns whatsoever. These are,
Well, I think it's right. Well, those are the debate topics that are going on in the news every day. But what I want people to hopefully take away from this is there's a lot of noise, but not a lot of it is actually substantive, right? Because regardless of whether or not we have what we need today, or we could have what we need, or if there is in fact a need because the government's tyrannical, all of those different debates are irrelevant in a reality in which guns cannot be controlled, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say we do or do not have a tyrannical government. That doesn't actually have any impact on whether or not we need guns, because every single person, and this is the second point in the article, has the ability to create guns at home. Cody Wilson and Defense Distributed made sure of that back in 2013 with the release of the Liberator and their plans in the last years. Despite their legal troubles, any one of these plans could be found to create your own firearm at home right now. And that also includes people create their own bullets at home all the time. And now they just do it for fun. Imagine if they actually needed to do it, what that world would look like. So to say, oh, the government is this or isn't this, it is a very interesting conversation, but it's so theoretical because we're living in a world that is past that. Guns exist. We can all have them, and you can't take them away.
Right. What about the notion that somehow the armaments that the average gun owner has simply couldn't possibly take on America's military? Have they read any history about the Vietnam War? Have they read any history of a number of insurrections taking place in the first and second worlds around this planet? What's going on there?
I mean, I think resistance is a very reasonable point to consider. I acknowledge that there are arguments that, the increased militarization of police, the increased capabilities of the government, but there's really two parts to that. One is that these are very real human beings who are police officers and who are soldiers in the United States Army. And yes, there are historical examples where the majority of a population has been oppressed by people in those positions. But I would like to think, and perhaps I'm overly optimistic, that the American ethos is such that there is a little bit of a higher calling beyond a figurehead demanding that we become an authoritarian government, right? At the end of the day, there are going to be police officers and there are going to be members of the military who are given an unconstitutional directive, and they're going to say, are you kidding me? I'm not doing that. And that's, that is inherently American. So in terms of a resistance, not only would there be massive numbers of Americans who would stand up against a government that attempted to take that move, but in many cases, they'd probably be led by the people who were, until very shortly before, assigned the task of taking those guns. It's the setup that it would do would be absolutely horrendous in terms of loss of life. But it is part of the calculation, I think, and another reason why it's simply not possible to disarm the population of the United States at this point. And that's, again, the debate that's happening now is, especially on the left with these proposals, is how do we disarm the population? How do we disarm segments of the population? For example, the red flag laws. How do we ban certain types of weapons from being in the hands of private citizens? Those conversations are not interesting to me because it's not possible in any way.
I'm gonna play devil's advocate here because, quite frankly, the red flag argument scares the crap out of me. I grew up in an era, and probably as overstated as the Red Menace was, where the post-breakup of the Soviet Union, post-Brezhnev days, led to an influx of first-generation Americans who had lived through Ceausescu, who had lived through Brezhnev, had lived through a variety of societies where the vaguest psychological terms were often used as a method to silence people at one level or another early on in post-World War II, confiscate weaponry, and this type of extra-legal, not accountable, absence of the proper stages of justice was actively used in, again, first world countries. And so, particularly since when you get into the woods in a conversation, let's say a hearing, not so much at the talking, screaming heads level on TV or radio, not so much in Facebook chat rooms, but when I've heard a testimony very often used that the high suicide rate amongst American veterans is used anecdotally against veterans and as a justification, and to conflate that as a justification, I should say, to engage in red flag laws. I've had elected officials tell me to my face that they want red flag laws to save our veterans. That scares the crap out of me.
And red flag laws have, in the last weeks, become very popular with Republicans. Trump has said that. He rolled it back, of course, very quickly, but, he was in favor of red flag laws for a very quick minute. Crenshaw, even Rhode Island governor, actually, Raimondo, correct? She came out and ripped on your legislature for not taking those steps. But I still think that within those 5 points, so let's say that as an individual, someone does have a red flag EPRO act taken against them and they are left temporarily disarmed. Mm-hmm. In modern America, with the advent of ghost gunning, the ability to create your own guns at home, human exchange, right? There's always going to be someone out there with a stockpile willing to sell to the right person. I don't think it's possible to truly disarm someone. And I think that's really the point that I'm trying to make, is that even if someone does get hit with a act like this, there's always another avenue for them to exercise their fundamental right to self-defense. I do want to acknowledge what you said, though, has a lot of power, that the history of this has shown a lot of examples where these sorts of things have worked. And I alluded to that just a little bit into the article, but I'd be very curious to hear more kind of what it was like to live through that, right? I was born in 1990. I didn't have the benefit of living through those kind of experiences, but I do think the long-term risk to the Second Amendment and to the fundamental rights of self-defense is in changing the way we think. Every year, there are fewer people that hunt because parents are not passing that down to their kids. Every year, there are more kids who are hearing the narrative about gun ownership being wrong. And whether it takes one generation or 10 generations, that could be beaten out of the American population. So this is, and I do acknowledge that as a shortfall of my argument, is it's only a snapshot in time. And I think there's a Ronald Reagan quote out there that, it only takes one generation for us to lose everything we have. And all we have to do is hopefully continue to be vigilant to ensure that doesn't happen.
Well, and one need, sadly, Venezuela has become the poster child for about every neocon/conservative and even some libertarian arguments. The de-arming, if you will, of the Venezuelan society clearly has had an impact in these terrible times to their ability to fight. We saw Venezuelans being shot in the streets by their, and this is we've had two situations, one very highly publicized and one not so. And obviously, we all saw Venezuelans shot in the streets by their own military. We saw violent means employed against Spaniards looking to discuss and vote on a peaceful secession from the Spanish government. Now, Spain is a first world nation. It's considered a democracy with a vestige of a monarchy. What happened in those riots? So again, playing devil's advocate, your point's well taken. One would love to believe, but again, it's all about information. What's happening generationally, as you point out, particularly in vast parts of the country now, particularly in the coastal areas, that American children have no contact with guns other than as some sort of arcane, amorphous concept, as opposed to a hands-on experience. They have nothing to judge them by other than what they are being spoon-fed. I'm not a conspiracy guy. I'm not. But I just see society seeing the conventional wisdom is two or threefold when it comes to civil liberties. The great cliches of all time. If you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to worry about. Guns are for other people. That's the Bible-thumping hunter types from the great flyover country. When I look at Pennsylvania, hundreds of times probably, I've driven through an area called the Wild, and in along central and southern Pennsylvania, there's this great vast stretch in between the outer districts of Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, where hunting culture is still very, very strong. They're beautiful parts of the country, wonderful people. Outstanding places to live. But that's becoming the extreme now. That's almost, kind of a cute look back in time. Whereas so many kids now, just because also of the absence of any education whatsoever in civil liberties, really don't understand that the American Revolution was not a peaceful group of people coming together in a chat room deciding to, say, "Aw, shucks, all right, we'll still be friends, we'll have that special relationship." The United States of America exists because of a series of increasingly violent actions started by the burning of the Gaspee right here in Warwick, Rhode Island, where the revolution really began, by the way, not some joint up in Boston or something, some sort of nonsense, Lexington or whatever. That's where it really began. And people died. And people died for the cause. There's a great series done on what happened to all the signers of the Declaration of Independence, in their lives after that. Many of them died bankruptcy. Many of them died in jail. Many of them gave up entire lives of comfort. Those were the gentry at the time who decided to walk away from that, and the reaction to that in their lives was violent. It was not a peaceful separation. It was a bloody, bloody divorce. So it scares me. But then again, popular culture will then paint me as someone who's an extremist.
And I know we're running up on 8:30 here too, but I do want to make sure I get in a note of optimism,
Okay.
which I think is important, and that is that there are some really great voices out there doing some really great things. One of the places that this article ran was on 71 Republic, which is a libertarian-leaning news organization that's primarily made up of young authors. When I say young, I'm 28 years old. A lot of these people are in their late teens, early 20s, and they are so far further ahead than I would have even imagined when I was, 10 years younger. And organizations like that, of these people who are coming together. It's a decentralized world, right? We were talking about this earlier, where these different news outlets and social media platforms allow people to come together in great ways. That's a great group of people who's doing really fantastic work. Governor Sununu up in New Hampshire just vetoed 3 bills today that came out of the legislature that would have instituted many of these bad ideas that we've been talking about all night. And even voices like Ann Coulter, not someone who I normally praise on in any venue. We disagree on a lot of things, but she was taking Donald Trump to task today for even considering those kinds of measures. So it is exciting to at least see some people taking a stand, doing the things that they need to do to move the ball forward and protect our liberties at the end of the day.
And you're absolutely right. First of all, on a couple of accounts, that's where I read your work for the first time, was on 71 Republic. Great stuff, and you're right. It's heartening to see young folks, because I'm now in, guys like me and Tom Arnold are in that. Yeah, all the younger ladies in the Liberty Movement are friendly to us now, because we're the grandfathers now. It's fun, but I wish I was younger. The challenge that I'm going to issue to folks who are either listening now or listening in the future is that I believe one of the more insidious parts of this red flag legislation, and I want to pick up this conversation again in a couple of weeks, because I really enjoy your input and your approach and your reasoning. But one of the ways that we can fight this is the notion that federal funding for a lot of things is going to be based on compliance with some of these proposed red flag laws. And ironically, Rhode Island adopted red flag legislation. For everyone who thinks the ACLU doesn't automatically support folks who are 2A friendly, well, I'll tell you, the Rhode Island ACLU here was one of the strongest opponents of the red flag laws that passed here in Rhode Island last year. And Republicans, by the way, voted for those damn laws. But the laws that we have in place are not as strict as some of the laws, incredibly enough, being proposed at the federal level. And when you tie in funding, whether it be highways, drug prevention, so many of the wars on, fill in the blanks, whether it be the wars on drugs, the wars on sex work, the wars on civil liberties, are tied into federal funding. So that slowly boiling lobster, as we say here in New England, takes place because of our willingness to trade our liberties for federal loot, which ironically is our money to begin with. It was stolen from us using coercion. And that's an area I think we can all agree, and we need to fight, because funding should not be a litmus test. Getting back our own money should not be a litmus test for subscribing to some of these brutal abrogations of our civil liberties. And I think as libertarians, that's a strong, strong hill to stand on, even during times when emotions are running crazy. So where can folks find you on the web? Give us the litany of places.
Yeah, honestly, the easiest place to find me is ConnerDrigotas.com, ConnerDrigotas.com. It's my website, and the great thing about having a name like that is if you search me, I'm the only one out there. So feel free to Google me and find all my social handles otherwise.
Well, there are many articles on the site already, very thoughtful, very accessible, and that to me is the challenge that the Liberty Movement needs to face. You manage to combine reasoning with accessibility, and in an era dominated by what I call short attention span theater, that's going to be a very valuable tool in all of our fight to maintain and grab back the liberties that we've lost. So as always, I appreciate you taking the time on a Friday night to join us, and again, I thank you and salute your continuing contributions to liberty. All right, my friend?
Happy to be here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We'll talk soon.
All right, God bless, lad. Conner Drigotas, that's ConnerDrigotas.com. He's on Facebook, a couple of places, but go directly to the source. Some great articles, and I also want to tout 71 Republic and as a great example of independence working to promote liberty and libertarian values in a manner that basically subverts the kind of white noise you hear in the media and brings challenging conversations of challenging subjects right to folks and allows them the opportunity to join in and engage in the healthy kind of debate that we need to as a society. Conner, thanks again.